Good day everybody, and welcome to today's webinar, which is entitled Essential Tools for Smart 3D Spec Admins. My name is Andy Osborne. I'm Director of Global Business Development with CA Experts, and I'll be taking you through today's webinar. So in terms of topics, we're just going to go through this brief introduction that I'm giving now. Then we're going to go through some common issues, technical overview, tools for bulk load sheets, and then spec testing. We're then going to summarize that, go on to some feedback from yourselves, just like to get a little bit of feedback. Then we'll go on to your questions. So as we go through this webinar, please feel free to ask any questions in the question panel. We'll save that up to the end and go through as many as we can, and hopefully I can answer them either directly or I'll get back to you once I've had some technical input. Okay, now we will be recording the session, and that recording will be made available in the next day or two as a follow-up link, so don't worry about that. And if you do need copies of slides, we'd be more than happy to provide them to you. Okay, so the webinar itself, just the last bit of housekeeping, is probably only going to be around about 15-20 minutes, so it's a bit shorter than we normally do, but I guess that's good news from your point of view. I'm sure you've got many things to get back to, but we do appreciate you being here. Okay, so let's start with common issues, and the first ones we're going to start with is looking at bulk load sheets. So as you should know, bulk load sheets are generated incrementally when changes are needed. So every time you make a modification, you have a new bulk load sheet that you then load in. So for every change, there's a new bulk load sheet, and that needs to be managed alongside the previous sheets. So to get to a particular status, you end up having a series of sheets which you need to load in. And they need to be managed not only for revisions, but also loading sequence. So if you do want to load them into another project, it can be challenging, especially if you've introduced manual fixes such as revision of code lists during that initial process, because that needs to be taken into account and sequenced to ensure the correct loading. The other things with bulk load sheets is that it's quite difficult to know the current contents of your Smart 3D catalog in terms of the spec and how it's configured. If you do have bulk load sheets supplied to you, what are the differences between what is already in your Smart 3D system and the new bulk load sheet that you've been supplied? And then finally, of course, aligning that new bulk load sheet or aligning the 3D content, the catalog, to reflect the content of that newly supplied bulk load sheet can also be very difficult and time consuming. So that covers the bulk load sheets. Just if we come on to piping specs in general, if you wanted to make sure that your piping specs were absolutely error-free and there was no issue in placing those components when you get down to the design, then there's only one way really to do that, and that's to place each component into the model as a verification. Also, of course, you want to make sure that implied items such as gaskets and bolts are also defined, because again, without that, you've got an incomplete set of bill of materials. Now, although you could do this manually, it's not really a sensible option, primarily because of the volume of components. If you look at, just an individual valve or flange or whatever across the different bore ranges and different options that you've got, then clearly you may quite easily miss some of those out while you're going through the testing process. Secondly, it's going to be a time-consuming process, and there are many things probably more important to get on with than sitting in front of a screen and individually placing components. So that's kind of the background to what brought us to where we are today. And so what I want to do now is just give a very quick technical overview of what we're doing here. So the product that's addressing this is a product called Spec Expert, which is really aimed at Smart 3D spec admins, and there are a number of tools which are grouped together under this one particular product name. Originally, they were sold as two separate applications. So if you're familiar with some of our portfolio, you may remember bulk load sheet generator as being one of them, and of course the other one was Spec tester. Now, from Spec tester's point of view, we did require further enhancements, and we wanted to increase the robustness. So we needed to take that application forward. Bulk load generator also required enhancement to deliver more comprehensive outputs than it was previously. We also needed to introduce a bulk load sheet comparison function. So all of these little tools were merged together to create a single product to support the Spec admins, and that's really to provide greater value to you, our clients, but also reduce the number of products needed to address this particular topic. So how it all fits together, if we've got Smart 3D in the catalog here and we've got Spec Expert, there are a number of functions. So the first one is testing. So if we look at this, effectively we are placing the components individually through an automation capability. The first thing you'll see is it's basically placing those components within Smart 3D and it strings them together in each of the nominal bore sizes. So for each bore range you'll get a set of components which are all connected. So in the first instance you get a very good visual check as to whether something looks correct or something looks really out of place. Secondly, because it is connected piping, it means that you can generate isometrics. And because you can generate isometrics, that gives you the ability to also check the bill of materials, and it also gives you the ability to look at the S keys, the 2D symbols which are used on the isometrics, to make sure that they are correct as well. So there's a good sort of visual checking process that can be done with that particular part. Of course, the second thing, and probably more important, is we generate a report using, or we load this into an Access database. And the first thing that we get out of here is a report that shows us all parts which are not placed or have been placed. Clearly the ones that are not placed, they're the ones that need some further looking at. But then what we also do is we capture the to-do list entries directly from Smart 3D and then bring that into this report itself. And again, we just use this, go through, identify the areas, and then go back to the spec and then fix it. So that covers the testing aspect. The other side of it is we have on the bulk load files the ability to extract the bulk load sheets directly from the Smart 3D catalog. Now we have had a few requests where companies have accidentally deleted their bulk load files, and trying to get back to those manually is a bit of a nightmare. So this has come in very handy in terms of regeneration of those bulk load sheets. But if I click on this, what it will do is it will open up a directory and it will give you a list of the various different bulk load sheet outputs that we have. So we've got things like specification data, code lists, generic dimensional data, insulation data, material control data, piping catalog data, plant options and plant rules. And if I open, for example, the piping catalog data, what we'll see in here are all the different tables that we need within this bulk load sheet. So quite a lot of work if you're going to replicate this manually again. Coming back to the beginning, one of the things that we do is we add an index sheet as well, which is not required from a loading point of view, but it certainly makes life easier in terms of understanding what is in this set of bulk load sheets. So we can see the references, and each one of these are basically linked through to the various sheets. So you've got the hyperlink so you can just navigate straight to it. So that makes life a little bit easier as well. Okay, then when we come on to the comparison side of it, basically we have a current bulk load sheet, and that current bulk load sheet could of course be excuse me, the one that we've extracted directly from Smart 3D. But then as a project, you may have been supplied a requested bulk load sheet. This is what we want you to have in your Smart 3D spec now. Now the challenge there is, well, what do I have already, and what do I need to get to understand the differences and therefore write something that aligns this requested spec with the current system. And so that's what it does. It basically does a comparison, then generates, so if I just open that, that's the bulk load sheet that we've been supplied. This is our current bulk load sheet, and what we end up with is a comparison bulk load file, which again we've got an index, and we can see that these are the various different actions. So we've got added, modified, deleted. It's gone through all of the tables, and it said, right, on the piping commodity filter table there are actually 2 additions, 1 modification and 2 deletions. Well, I can hyperlink through to that, and we can see those actions are clearly identified against these components. So that's now can be run in, and it will align now your spec to that bulk load sheet. Okay, so just going through it in a bit more detail, when we're looking at the tools for bulk load sheets, we're regenerating the bulk load sheets directly from the Smart 3D catalog, which guarantees 100% synchronization when loading specs into other projects. Now, by doing that, that removes the need to load multiple bulk load sheets in a correct sequence to go from one system to another. And it's also got a very, very simple user interface. There is no installation, or very little, no configuration, I should say, once installed. No end user training required. User selection of a Smart 3D project. So the user selects a Smart 3D project. Then they select the piping specs for export using tick boxes. And then they just simply request the creation of the bulk load files. And that's it. That is how you work with this application, and I will show you the interface in a minute. For bulk load sheet comparison, you're wanting to compare 2 different bulk load sheets. As I've said, bulk load sheet 1 could be supplied by a client or a partner or the project team. Bulk load sheet 2 could be an extraction from Smart 3D. You create a comparison bulk load sheet, capture the differences, and then apply the difference bulk load sheet to the Smart 3D catalog to synchronize the content in line with that first sheet. That removes the potential for introducing discrepancies between what is required and the final catalog. And it also dramatically reduces the effort required to align your Smart 3D catalog with the project requirements. So here is the user interface, and very, very simple. So what we have is the project that we're selecting, and that will then produce a drop-down list of all of the specs. What we're then doing is we're looking at the various different options for output. So this is the pipe spec with part, plant options, insulation data, pipe bending data, etc., etc. So you select which options you want to export, and then you quite simply press create from catalog, and it will print out or produce all of those Excel bulk load files that we showed you before. So I don't think you can get much simpler than that. When we're comparing bulk load files, it's, I guess, slightly more complex in so much as what we need to do is provide a folder for the requested files, a folder for the current files, so these are the 2 that we're comparing, and then an output folder for the resulting comparison. And having specified that, we simply come along and just say compare, and it will run through, process that, and produce the result, which you can then load in. So again, very simple. From a spec testing point of view, let's look at that in a little bit more detail. So we're verifying component placement. So what it's doing, it's providing a comprehensive quality assurance check on all spec components for any given spec that you're checking. The system attempts to place every component in the Smart 3D model. Any that are not placed are reported, and we've seen the report. It verifies the implied items exist, such as bolts, nuts, washers, gaskets. And the overall checking process only takes a few minutes of user interaction. But if you were to do this manually and then compared the time difference, this would save around about 90% of the man hours from manually going through and placing it one by one. And as we've already said, there's no guarantee that you'll cover every item that you need. Now, this does not replace the standard capability, the verify consistency check that is part of Smart 3D. So what we do recommend is that you run the verify consistency check within Smart 3D first, you resolve any problems, and then you go through with the spec testing function after that. So how you run a placement? Well, firstly, we've got, again, the drop down on the project. We've got the list of specs with tick boxes. We can even tick individual bore ranges, so we don't necessarily have to check the whole spec. We could just home in on one or two items. So simply we select that and then come up and just say run, and that's it. It then loads it in, generates a report. You then go through that report and then track down any issues that you find. Okay, I said it was a fairly quick overview. So in terms of summary, we're talking about regeneration of bulk load sheets from Smart 3D catalogs. So you identify the current spec content, and it allows easy migration to other projects and companies. You can compare and generate different bulk load sheets. You can verify placement. So Spec Tester physically places all parts and combinations of parts to report possible errors in the catalogue, and that saves around 90% of the man hours. And that's really why we're saying Spec Expert provides essential tools for Smart 3D spec admins.